Cheers, everybody. How you doing today? I'm Joe Kling from Quaff Home Brewing Club in San Diego, California, host of the 2011 National Home Brewing Conference, San Diego, California. Now, I'm here today to tell you about fermenting in kegs. I personally ferment in kegs, although there's many people who ferment in carboys and plastic buckets. That's just fine, and plenty of people make great beer using those. I simply have moved to fermenting in kegs because, at least for myself, I feel it's better. To ferment in a keg, siphon your beer into the keg just like you would your carboy. Now, you want to make a blow-off with a gas disconnect and about 3, maybe 4 feet or so, however much you need, of high pressure tubing. You put the gas disconnect on the gas end post, put the end in a jar or bucket or whatever of sanitizer. Now you've made yourself a blow-off. For a 5-gallon batch you need 2 kegs, 10-gallon batch you need 3 kegs. The reasoning for that is you just don't, I like to avoid blow-off if I can, and especially with a 10-gallon batch, your kegs are going to be even fuller. If you're really worried about blow-off, if you're making something like a Hefeweizen or a high alcohol beer, high gravity beer like a barley wine or Russian Imperial Stout, you could always cut part of this tubing off and put like some other 1/2-inch tubing on it, like you would for a auto siphon, over it, and that way you've got a lot bigger blow-off hoops. Now, once your beer is done fermenting or nearing the end of fermentation and you want to take a hydrometer sample, you're going to need another piece of equipment. What that is what's called a jumper hose. Simply all it is a 4 to 5 feet of 3/16 ID tubing with 2 liquid disconnects on the end. One of them has to be what's called a flare disconnect. What a flare disconnect does is it can screw off of the main barb. The other type of disconnect is called a barb disconnect. As you can see, the barb is actually connected to the disconnect. Where with this one, the barb is not connected. There's simply some ridges that can screw onto this, and the barb is right here inside the hose. The reason for you want to do this is you want to be able to clear yeast both when you take your hydrometer sample and when you transfer the beer to your serving keg. So, you want to take a hydrometer sample, you want to put some gas in your fermenting keg. You only need about 10 seconds. You don't need very much pressure because you're only trying to get a very small amount of beer. Once you get the pressure in there, of course, you're going to want it unscrewed from the flare disconnect. Put this end in something, hook that on until the yeast clears out of the tubing. Once it's done that, take this off, put this end in your hydrometer test jar, put that back on, let it fill up. Once you've got enough to get your reading, take this off. You now have your hydrometer sample just like if you used a wine thief. You can put your blow-off back on. Once you've taken your readings and you feel as though your beer is finished, you now want to jump it from the fermenting keg to the serving keg. First thing you want to do is you want to flush your serving keg with CO2 because we don't want a bunch of oxygen in there. Oxygen is no good for beer. Oxygen is good for wort, not beer. So hook that on there, let it completely fill up. Once it's full, take this off, turn your pressure relief valve and let that CO2 out. Turn the pressure relief valve back to closed, put that on, let it fill up. Once it's done filling, take this off and put this on. Now for the transfer from the fermentation keg to the serving keg, I don't turn my pressure down at all because I've got 5 feet of resistance here. This is plenty of resistance. You don't have to worry about turning it down to 2 or 3 psi. It's not needed. Now, once this is full of CO2, I'm going to hook the liquid disconnect back up to here. First, put this end without the disconnect on it into some kind of jar, clear the yeast. Once the yeast is cleared, take that off. Then put the flare disconnect back on, get it good and tight. Put it onto the fermenting keg, and go to your serving keg, turn your pressure relief valve a quarter turn, the way it's open. Now you're going to get a bunch of CO2 coming out of there, but CO2 is heavy in air, so this is still full of CO2. You don't have to worry about any oxygen pickup. You're going to take this, hook this other end up to the liquid out, pop it on there, and now you'll see the beer start to fill up. It'll fill up, of course, through the dip tube, through the bottom. You don't want to step away from this for too long because it doesn't take but about 3 minutes to fill, because you've only got about 2.5, 3 gallons of beer in here. Let it fill. Once you either see yeast start coming up into here or you start hearing CO2 bubbling down the bottom, pop that off. Now you've got one keg of your 2 kegs that are fermenting filled up to here. So this is about half full. Now you're going to hook that up to your other keg and do the same thing. Take this off, clear the yeast, put it back on, and then put, of course, the gas on your second fermentation keg, and then fill this. What you're going to watch for now is make sure no beer comes out here. I recommend doing this in an area that you can make a little bit of a mess. Put a towel down if you're doing this on the carpet, or if you're doing it somewhere else. Just make sure, because some beer may come out of here. Because I personally, I make 5.5 to 6 gallons of wort, because I realize I'm going to lose some hydrometer samples, transfers, and this and that, because I like to have a completely full keg of beer when I put it on tap. So you gotta watch it. If you see, sometimes you'll see beer come out of there, sometimes you won't. You know, if you started off with 5 gallons of wort, you're not going to see beer come out of there. So once it's finished, close that, take these off, and now you have a full keg of beer. Chill it, carbonate it, just like you normally would. So now I've showed you how to ferment a keg, how to take a hydrometer sample, and how to transfer it into your serving keg. Take a drink here. Cheers. I hope to influence you to fermenting kegs, because I think it's a great option. It's more similar to what a brewery actually does, because they transfer everything with CO2 pressure, and I think they do. I'm not a professional brewer, don't quote me on it. But of course they're transferring all of their fermented beer, I believe, under CO2 pressure. That way they're not going to oxygenate anything. And that's important because, you know, getting oxygen into your fermented beer can give it off flavors, kind of like a wet paper cardboard or a sherry type flavor. Plus it can kind of kill hop aroma, which Vinny Salurzo talked about in a recent Zymergy article. He talks about flushing your auto siphons and everything with CO2. That might be kind of a pain. Flushing this with CO2 is pretty easy. You might ask about, well, why don't we flush this with CO2? Good reason we don't need to is because the first thing that's coming into here is not going into the serving keg. It's the yeast that we're pushing out. So when we actually go from here to the serving keg, this is already full of beer. So we don't really have to worry about any oxygen. It's a non-issue. Cheers. I hope to see many home brewers in San Diego in June of next year, 2011, for the National Home Brewers Conference. It's going to be a great time. And cheers. Happy brewing.